understand exactly what we have in our past, though, we have to look at how we look at history. It's very important. And you may recall that we oftentimes debate about who's actually responsible for recording history. I mean, historians don't actually record history. They read past history and they interpret it. They give us the current accepted standard, which is known as official history. Although many, and in the comments section, have indicated that journalists record history, such as Ida M. Tarbell, a known muckraker. And granted, we don't have Ida M. Tarbell anymore, a reliable journalist. We have modern journalists. And it should be noted that current mainstream historians recognize that mainstream journalists don't always tell the truth, for a variety of reasons. What's the difference between historical revisionism and negationism? Is it where we just throw away books? Well, we have an official definition for it. We even have a way in which it applies to all of us. And we'll go through it because it's important to understand. Historical negationism, otherwise known as historical revisionism, first coined by Henry Rousseau as a term to describe the denial of the Holocaust. This brief uses the term historical negationism instead of revisionism for the same reason Rousseau coined it, to avoid confusing denial with legitimate, scholarly revision of contemporary understanding of history, as might happen when researchers discover new sources. So yes, it's that historical revisionism. Round and round he goes, where he ends up, no one knows. And that's exactly how it feels. Why are things always changing? What is real history? The history of negative expressions in various languages makes us witness the following curious fluctuation. The original negative adverb is first weakened, then found insufficient. And it's important to understand words and perceptions. Oddly enough, this is written by Otto Jespersen, Negation in English and Other Languages. In other words, the meaning of words themselves can be subverted, changed, and altered, and then suddenly we have the same development as the original word. So what are we really getting at? Is it very confusing? Is it difficult to know exactly when history really transpired and when we've changed and altered it? How exactly do we understand that we have 1,000 lost years, and what exactly do we mean by that? Is it just that we had 1,000 years where we didn't record history? Or are the previous 1,000 years themselves lost and subject to question? Well, if you actually look at what mainstream history tells you, it is very clear that we have a definitive written record of history, and that there are no questions or concerns about it. There is no reason why we should believe that the history that we agree upon, did we agree upon it, is the official history. And certainly people who ask questions are people who may be perceived as troublemakers. Now, imagine with me, if you will, a new development in civilization. Let's say 30 years from now, we have an entirely different civilization that develops. A new society that has different symbols, different manners of dress. In fact, entirely different social mores. For example, if you went back 100 years to the year we think of as 1923, then what exactly would you say? What would be the difference between what you see in 1923 and 2025? And of course, I avoid using the even 100 years because that's just too easy to do. Is there a reason why we always affiliate with 1,000 years? And what role do scientists and historians play in understanding what really happened? And the difference between a conspiracy and a conspiracy theory? Here we have the great Carl Sagan himself, identified as an incredible astronomer and a wonderful science communicator. And it should be noted that Carl Sagan was very adept at speaking in terms that everyone could understand. That's why he was considered a great communicator. Although there are some historians who say that his knowledge and use of history wasn't exactly, well, how shall we say, accurate. But he certainly knew about the planets, even if he never actually went to space. He didn't need to, he was that intelligent. Much in the same way that historian Mary Beard, who I acknowledge is probably one of the finest writers you would ever hope to read because her writing skills are incredibly detailed. And she's able to lay out many wonderful ideas and defend them with various forms of historical understanding, and citing the writings of the actual historians of the Roman Empire. What's intriguing, though, is that, much like Carl Sagan never went to space, and yet is an expert astronomer, Mary Beard is an expert in Roman history, though she never lived a single day in Rome, and never talked to an actual Roman citizen. Now let's take this idea to a different place. Arthur C. Clarke, a science fiction author. Now, of course, you're saying, a science fiction author? What would he have to do with anything legitimate such as science or history? Well, it's intriguing to note that Arthur C. Clarke was considered a proponent for space travel. He wrote about space travel. Now, of course, you'll say it was merely speculative fiction, what would be termed science fiction. But another peculiar detail about Arthur C. Clarke, he knew a lot about space travel, or he could imagine it, but he never actually went to space. And I certainly acknowledge that many of his novels are very well written. So what do we have here? We have a model suggested by journalists and politicians to explain conspiracy theories. Social media and exposure to conspiracy theories, belief in conspiracy theories. And from journalists and politicians, it leads to illegal and dangerous behavior. And of course, it's in red, to make sure that you know it is not advisable. Now, what exactly is the model suggested by empirical social scientific evidence? That just rolls right off the tongue, doesn't it? Where do the beliefs in conspiracy theories actually come from? Well, according to empirical social behavior, it's psychological motivations, political motivations, social motivations. And what exactly do those lead to? And remember, this is the official model, the same thing, illegal and dangerous behavior. So whether it's politicians, journalists, scientists, or historians analyzing it, they say it all leads to the same thing. Thinking for yourself can lead to illegal and dangerous behavior. So you've got to be very, very careful. There were also governments that engaged in it, such as the former Soviet Union. In this famous picture with Stalin, he must have had very cold hands, therefore he had to keep them warm, where we had the unfortunate individual who was completely removed from the photo. And it should be noted that this process, this, how shall we say, historical denial that transpired, is well documented and did occur. It's an example of a government, a nation state, that is engaging in, how shall we say, unscrupulous historical practices. And as a result, the official historical account becomes very obscured. Of course, we're well aware of this. Now let's take a science fiction example, the story of Dune and the character of Duncan Idaho. Duncan Idaho portrayed by actor Richard Jordan. Now, if you're familiar with David Lynch's 1984 Dune, and of course the novel by Frank Herbert, you understand that Duncan Idaho ends up playing a very critical role in the story. And I know what you're saying if you only saw the movie. Wait a minute, he died. That was the end of it, right? Well, if you're familiar with it, no, Duncan Idaho is revived. He's actually cloned and goes through a series of transitions. What are those series of transitions, and what's it really come to in the story of Dune? Duncan Idaho is a very critical character who begins to understand that the flow of history, of course this is in the Dune novels, is not exactly as is intended, that human beings have some sort of destiny. What's intriguing, though, is to think of the Jason Momoa Duncan Idaho and compare and contrast him with the Richard Jordan Duncan Idaho. They're both very intriguing characters, and I'll give Jason Momoa credit, he definitely displayed by far the most humanity in the current Dune film, in my humble opinion. Obviously, there were many deleted scenes and footage we'll never see of Richard Jordan as Duncan Idaho. I wish we could have seen the films that David Lynch wanted to make to tell the rest of the Dune story. It would have been very intriguing seeing Frank Herbert in that role, and gaining that understanding of what history really means, and how it's influencing humanity. Now back to the topic of denialism. There's an official denial that occurred in the 1950s with the rhetoric from President Dwight D. Eisenhower. During the time of the 1950s, the United States realized that they needed a rearmed Western Germany. And so as a result of this, Eisenhower softened a lot of the speeches that he made, condemning former members of the German military in World War II for the heinous acts that official history says that they committed during World War II. And as a result of this created what was called the myth of the clean German armed forces in World War II. Here's an interesting image. We have the soldiers of West Germany on the march. And yes, these are actually German soldiers, the new Bundeswehr, the German Defense Force of West Germany, and they're very obvious in American equipment. I bet they never thought that they were going to be marching or carrying weapons again. Look like a very eager bunch, don't they? It's an intriguing thought, though. And what prompted this? Well, at the time, with the Cold War on the rise, It was assessed that the NATO armies fielded needed more of a boost to actually stand against the terrifying legions of the Soviet Union, and therefore a rearmed West Germany was the only solution imagined at that time. It was a very controversial move, and yet there was a practical reason behind it. Yes, the German army using surplus U.S. equipment. And keep in mind that during World War II, the United States provided more ammunition for the armed forces of the Soviet Union, the Red Army, than it did for its own military. How fascinating. Yes, those American surplus tanks, not the venerable great Leopard 2 tanks that the German army would be well known for. But it's very intriguing thinking of this development. Also, it's interesting to note that during the administration of Dwight D. Eisenhower, he favored what was called massive retaliation. That's massive nuclear retaliation. In fact, the United States Army during the 1950s didn't favor its infantry or armor formations, what is today called maneuver warfare. But they actually favored air defense, artillery, as the foremost branch. How different things were in the 1950s. Well, if they were going to rearm West Germany, then guess what that meant? Oh, that's a very nice and intriguing building there. During the political times, it meant that East Germany had to be rearmed by the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union didn't hesitate to do that, despite the fact that Germany was their mortal enemy and had created so much damage in their homeland. Well, that Russian officer looks particularly happy that he actually has Germans that are now fighting for him, or fighting for his side, I should say. And look at these East German soldiers. Don't they look like they're just having a grand old time? As though they never thought they were going to get out to the range again. And here they are with big smiles on their faces. And so what do we really have? The first step to prevent conspiracy theories is to know that they exist. Be aware and stop the spread. And how exactly is this supposed to be done, and who published this? What are they? The belief that events are secretly manipulated behind the scenes by powerful forces with negative intent. Nobody manipulates events behind the scenes, right? Conspiracy theories have 6 things in common: an alleged secret plot, a group of conspirators, old admirals in Starfleet, evidence that seems to support the conspiracy theory, they divide the world into good and bad, they scapegoat people and groups. Why do they flourish? They offer an explanation of events or situations which are difficult to understand. The need is heightened in times of uncertainty, like any sort of health emergency, war, or even when you can't watch your favorite sporting team. How do they take root? They start as suspicion. And then, of course, anybody can't stop conspiracy theories. And why do people spread them? Most believe they're true. And this is from our friends at the European Commission. So be sure that you keep your eyes open for conspiracy theories, because the European Commission doesn't want people thinking for themselves, or they're concerned about it. Kind of goes back to this particular, hey, who is this guy? Oh, it's Indiana Jones. I didn't recognize him without the hat, the jacket, and the whip. And he said, nothing shocks me. I'm a scientist, and nothing shocks me either, including Indiana Heston. This is Anatoly Fomenko, and he is known for positing a theory that there's over 1,000 lost years in history. And we had to understand that concept of historical revision and negation because currently, Mr. Fomenko here is considered a negationist, a denier. He is not a mainstream historian. He is a mathematician who's indulged in what are termed pseudo-historical theories. But there's an interesting idea that he brings about. What if the last 1,000 years didn't happen? What about the history of the Middle Ages? Should his writings be read? And of course, if you go off of the European Commission and if you go off of official history, absolutely not. But there's something even more interesting when we look at the mainstream view of history. This is the cosmic calendar, featured by scientist Carl Sagan in the TV series Cosmos, which he hosted and narrated. And one of the things he posited was there were billions of years of history. And yet, despite the fact that there are billions of years of history represented by these calendar months, that human history was only in the very last day, last week, or even the last 12 minutes of the last day. In other words, there are billions of years of lost history. And why is that? Because there were no humans to record it. There weren't even any journalists to write about that evolution. When humans evolved. Where were the journalists to write about it? And we have all of these incredible, majestic structures. We have structures that you can actually go and see wherever you are in the land. And we have numerous pictures of very bizarre and exotic structures in unique and random locations. Now, of course, we always have to take every single image that we see with a grain of salt, knowing that in this present era, although this is not a recent development, there exists the technology to create images, and there exists the technology to alter existing images. So you have to be careful. I mean, is this a legitimate image that you're looking at here? Is this some kind of very, very old building where the builders apparently engaged in some unknown purpose for this device at the top? And why does it have tree branches coming out of it? Well, in addition to being artisans, they were also lovers of nature. Now, let's go back and look at the whole concept of the bastion fort, also known as the star fort or the geometrically precise foundation structure. And here we're looking at the layout and the plan of Fort Duquesne, or Pittsburgh, or whatever you want to actually call it, back during the time of the 7 Years' War, or the French Indian War, as they called it, in what would become the United States. And the explanation behind these elaborate and very beautiful bastion forts is that they were constructed for military purposes. Yes, these beautiful structures that had wonderful and incredible aesthetics to them were designed for military purposes. We even have numerous entire cities that are laid out in this same fashion. Now, this is something that we really should question, because if these were constructed for simple military purposes, then why would there be such an effort put into making them so aesthetically pleasing, into being so geometrically precise? And then even the gateways and the entryways have a very interesting and artistic layout of portals and doorways. What exact military purpose does this particular doorway serve? Well, you see, those mighty cannons couldn't blast their way through it. These structures were cannon-proof, and they also provided incredible defenses against cannon attack. And then you have these numerous walls, whether they're called Venetian walls, Aurelian walls, wonderful fortification walls. Now, a question I have for you is, how difficult would it be for us to construct such walls today? How much difficult would it be for us to build walls with bigger blocks? Yes, let's see what the military experts actually say about fixed fortifications or bastion forts. Here's one of the foremost experts, George S. Patton, a master in maneuver warfare from the United States Army. And I'll say it in his high-pitched voice: fixed fortifications are a monument to the stupidity of man. Wait a minute, what's that you're saying? George S. Patton had a high-pitched voice? Yes, actually he did. But we oftentimes confuse with actor George C. Scott, the Missourian, and his gravelly voice. Fixed fortifications are a monument to the stupidity of man. Isn't it interesting to think about that perception? Now, no one did that intentionally. Patton was a great movie from 1970. And it was during a time when the United States military was going through, well, just a lot of criticism. What about these current areas that we see that are dugout berms? This is done by a D7 dozer. Did some charlatans sell to all these lords of the Middle Ages that they could build these bastion forts utilizing labor and tying up very essential resources for years? Or is there some other explanation behind the bastion forts? Here you have the classic mass-produced World War II barracks by the United States. And remember, we're well aware of the achievements of the United States during World War II. Well, these were structures that they rapidly built so soldiers would have a roof over their head when they were training. And then let's not forget that the United States is also the same nation that completed the incredible construction feat of building 24 fleet carriers, or Essex-class carriers. Prior to World War II, the Royal Navy of the United Kingdom was considered the greatest navy in the land. But after World War II, it would be the United States Navy, with its now currently called carrier strike groups. So what's really the truth then behind this incredible history that we have? What actually happened? Were there really incredible forts and fortifications that there were no means to destroy during the Middle Ages and the late Renaissance and up to the 1700s? Or is there an entirely different explanation for it? Even looking at the grand history of the so-called cosmos, the theory being that everything originates from a single point known as the Big Bang. It's a theory, although I would say if someone presented a theory as a fact, that might be disingenuous. That if they said something that was a theory was a fact, might be engaging in some form of, dare I say, denialism? I guess you could call it revision, but we have different experts for different things. Scientists can tell you what happened scientifically, and historians actually tell you what happened in the past. What exactly does this picture represent? And who is this individual? Quite an interesting head that they have. And what happened after the fall of the Roman Empire? We have Clovis, king of the Franks, in 481. We don't even mention that terrible year 536 in this timeline. The Battle of Tours, which prevented the spread of Islam into Europe. So the official history says, although revisionist history says it was merely a raid and the battle wasn't all that decisive. The reign of Charlemagne, Charles the Great, the Holy Roman Emperor of the Carolingian Empire. And then 832, the Vikings invade. And that's about all you really need to know. Which Vikings are we talking about? Are we talking about the Lee Majors Vikings, or are we talking about the more current Vikings who have the shaved head? And the rule of Charlemagne was something that always interested me. Yes, here we have this image of Charlemagne where he kind of looks like Santa Claus with a very elaborate crown on his head. But even questioning the existence of Charlemagne is something that'll only get you in a lot of trouble. It's very clear that Charlemagne, or Charles the Great, yes, we go back and forth on how to actually say the name, because is it the Gaelic version of Charles? Is it the French version of Charles? Is it the English version of Charles? By the way, did they ever actually call it the Carolingian Empire, or was that a name that we assigned later? And now you start to see the issue that we have with our understanding of history. There's so many times that we assign terms later, after the fact, that we don't seem to have an actual understanding. And so, if we're referring to something as the Byzantine Empire, even though that empire did not call themselves the Byzantine Empire, then is that legitimate history? Or is that, how shall we say, a historical assignment? Are we not being true to the understanding of history? And that's really the question I want to pose. If we have an entire empire that existed for 1,000 years, and we're giving it the wrong name, then is that not the very beginning of losing 1,000 years? Because what name did they actually call it? And what's the truth behind the Holy Roman Empire? A Holy Roman Empire that didn't actually have anything to do with Rome. It was actually what would become the nation-state of Germany later. Why did they have the two-headed eagle? What exactly did it represent? Why would a nation adopt anything with a two-headed anything? It's very odd. There's the reference to the Western and the Eastern Roman Empire. The Eastern Roman Empire would survive. The Western Roman Empire was sacked and fell. The last Roman emperor in the Western Roman Empire, Romulus Augustus, and the Eastern Roman Empire enduring, as we call the Byzantine Empire. And whatever happened to the Huns? Well, they just kind of broke up and stopped doing their raids. You can even look in later eras of history, such as the rule of Otto the Great, and one of the founding powers of the Holy Roman Empire. And here you'll see that he's titled Otto Rex, or Otto Rex, King Otto. Quite elaborate headdress. And here we have this little relief, if you will, of Otto presenting a castle, a church, a cathedral to Jesus Christ himself. And Otto is depicted in a very, very small format because it's to show humility in the presence of Jesus and the saints. Well, how very pious of him. There's other historical questions that we have, though, such as the existence of figures like Joan of Arc. Now, I remember when I was teaching medieval history, there was quite an argument amongst the professors. Nobody argued if Joan of Arc existed, of course, but the role that she actually played in turning the tide for the 100 Years' War with France against England. Was Joan of Arc a general, a commander for the French army, or was she merely a standard bearer? In all the depictions, she's always armed, which is quite fascinating, although you could make the argument that a standard bearer needs to be armed. You can't have the enemy capturing the standard. But it's yet another example of a woman taking a leadership role and being remembered by history. And there are many other examples. Irene, Elizabeth, and the names go on and on. It seems to run counter to what our understanding was of the stated historical role of women in history. And so it creates a lot of questions. I mean, what exactly is the role of these interesting hats that these individuals are wearing? And what is the truth behind the bubonic plague? We're to understand that nearly half the population of Europe perished in a very short amount of time, that the reason that this plague was so devastating was that prior to the plague, the nations of Europe were experiencing a famine. And so they were already weakened by famine, and then the plague destroyed many others. Is that what happened? Or is it merely an explanation for a different series of events? The challenge that we have is that there is no one that we can actually talk to who experienced these events. We have to trust, and it doesn't matter what your view is on history, whether you're Marybeard, Carl Sagan, or Lucius Aurelian, or whoever, we have to trust those who recorded it. and trust that they recorded it properly. Not only that, but we also have to trust the chain of custody with the recorded documents. We have to trust the fact that when they were translated from different languages between different nations, different empires, that they were recorded properly. Why do we have a catacomb of so many bones below Paris, France? How many bones of how many individuals are down there? Millions? I suppose it depends on who you ask. And where did these bones come from? Why would these bones be arranged in this format? How exactly does this reflect the values at the time of Christianity, which was the only known religion in Europe at the time? Although there were others, such as the Gnostics, but the Gnostics were completely destroyed during the so-called Albigensian Crusades. Are all these structures exactly constructed in the way that we think that they are? Some with construction timelines of hundreds of years? And by the way, does anybody know what structure in the United States where you see this same geometric precision that you see on the ceiling of this incredible cathedral? And I'll give you a hint, it's not a cathedral in the United States. It has a very different purpose. And yet you'll find many structures that reflect this geometric precision. What's really the truth behind this rule that we have of all these kings and queens and all the concepts of feudalism? And the other question I have that we should consider is, why is it that we put such priority on the royalty, but who else do we remember? For example, we have very well-tracked lineages, very well-tracked family trees. Is it a coincidence then that in many of our high fantasy novels, you'll also see family trees and lineages? And do we actually have legitimate lineages of family names for commoners, for peasants, which as we understand it, was essentially 99% of the population in Europe, those who worked the land, or the serfs, or the lower class? So why exactly would we have a very profound and accurate family record? I mean, they were just part of the resources tied to the land. Yes, it was a form of forced labor. But if you were just barely being able to make ends meet with producing food, then how could you reassign half the population to construct these elaborate bastion forts? How would they even have the knowledge to construct them? You might have an engineer such as Balian of Ibelin on hand, who looks a lot like Orlando Bloom, but you just wouldn't have the actual manpower to construct these structures. And what's the reality behind the Byzantine Empire? Did Justinian really exist in the way that we think that he did? Is this what he looked like? And what about his general who is forgotten, Belisarius? Is this what he looked like? We don't know for sure if this is Belisarius, or is it Belrios? If anybody gets that reference, let me know. And of course, even the existence of Otto Rex, the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. Well, we have a coin of him, so he must have existed, right? What exactly is going on with his face when you look closely at this coin? I don't know, maybe it's just eroded to the forces of time. But we look at all of these incredible family trees and these records and these lineages that we have. And it becomes a lot easier to have a royal family assigned for each nation. I mean, a royal family that's recorded and tracked for each nation. But what about the rest of the population? For example, on my mother's side, we can trace our family name all the way back to the 1400s. But the only thing we have is just a list of names and dates. We don't have exact locations where they lived, and we certainly don't know what their deeds were, their professions, or any other details about their life. It's very peculiar. So what really was going on in this last 1,000 years? Is it exactly as history tracked it? Or are there a few things that aren't exactly as we'd have them believe? Not because there's a conspiracy, not because anyone's trying to mislead anyone, but simply because along the way, perhaps some unscrupulous power changed the records. I mean, it is well documented that we have corrupt governments that would do that. Not our current governments, of course, but governments in the past. And what's the reality behind this incredible crown of the Holy Roman Emperor? I remember when I first saw it, and I made an offhand comment that it kind of reminded me of that crown I could snag at Burger King back in the day. This was a long time ago, but I don't know. What are your thoughts on this? Did we lose 1,000 years, or is history as we remember it? Join me for another look at history. The Gilded Age was quite intriguing, as is the era of the robber barons, where we understand that there were many individuals who have different reputations and different names, What exactly is a robber baron, and where is the name derived from? Why do these individuals have such mixed reputations, and what role do they play in our history, in our true history? We've long had many concepts of political corruption in America, or the United States, depending on what you want to call it today. And in these particular concepts of corruption, it's either been local officials or politicians at the highest level who have perhaps, how shall we say, been susceptible to certain influences of corruption. But what about the 1800s and the Gilded Age era? How was it the United States was able to go so rapidly from a new nation with very rural agrarian roots into this incredible industrialized powerhouse that in fact was a world power at the beginning of the 20th century or the early 1900s? And what exactly led to it becoming a world power? Well, we look at this development, this rapid urbanization of the United States, a compilation of many different peoples. And we have these robber barons, and who exactly is this individual? And I'm asking this question openly. Do we know exactly who these people are in these pictures, or do we just assume that we know? What if someone made a mistake at some point in time? Well, it's just something to think about, and I wanted to run this by you. Now let's look at Andrew Carnegie, industrialist and philanthropist, 1835 to 1919, the individual who started the Great Steel Empire. And we're well aware that Andrew Carnegie is never referred to as a robber baron. He's oftentimes referred to as a philanthropist, an individual who built a great empire, a captain of industry, a hero, if you will. And we're well aware of his steel empire. Why wasn't he assigned the term robber baron, or as I say in this exploration, reset baron? Perhaps it had something to do with the fact that he did really embrace philanthropy, although it should be noted that he has that interesting dual reputation. He was a captain of industry and a leader in the philanthropist age. Cornelius Vanderbilt, 1794 to 1877, the business magnate, the railroad man, and the original American robber baron. And why exactly did he get the term robber baron? The term is derived from feudal lords in Germany who exacted tolls on bridges and roads, and it was said to be unfair tolls. They were corrupt and they bent the law. Of course, we've looked at the account of J.P. Morgan, and you can certainly see his name all over the place, and in fact, the J.P. Morgan Bank offers the best interest rates in many respects when it comes to savings accounts and certificates of deposit, even to this day. He was one of the great financial leaders. And then, of course, we have the massive John Jacob Astor family, a family with many different generations. But why would we consider these individuals robber barons? Well, were they really robber barons? Or did they have some other reputation that was actually associated with them? We have this mixed historical view of these individuals because we see them as being both the leaders and captains of American industry with the so-called Second Industrial Revolution, which in the official history came after the American Civil War, and they're the individuals that really brought the United States into the quote-unquote modern age. I suppose you could say it's the same mixed reputation that Stalin has with his 5-year plans and how he brought the Soviet Union into the modern industrial age. Yet we look at the humble origins of the Astor family and we see how well that they lived in the past with incredible mansions and castles and other wondrous structures. Their wealth developed throughout the 1800s of the 19th century when everything else happened. We're most familiar, though, with John Jacob Astor IV, an individual who, according to official history, opposed the creation of a central bank. And, in fact, many of the political inclinations that the progressive era of the early 1900s was leaning towards. However, we know what became of John Jacob Astor IV. Unfortunately, he perished during his crossing of the Atlantic in the fateful voyage on the Titanic. And here is an image of him in his later years. And if you did, in fact, see that film in 1997, which many people did, you'll recall that John Jacob Astor IV was portrayed by American German-born actor Eric Braeden, also known as Victor Newman, in the long-running soap opera Young and the Restless. Boy, this guy gets around. He shows up in everywhere. Escape from the Planet of the Apes, and of course in Colossus, the Forbin Project. Unfortunately, most of his scenes were excised from Titanic, but James Cameron's a legendary director, apparently. So what's really the account with these robber barons, these captains of industry, or these philanthropists? Why do they have so many mixed reputations? Even contemporary accounts from the time frame show that these individuals have these mixed reputations. Some of them were simply great business leaders, according to the official history. And yet at other times they were very corrupt individuals. Cornelius Vanderbilt, for example, circumventing and going around local laws and apparently encouraging public officials to charge more for transportation fees, and therefore he was able to underbid transportation for the transportation of goods, and therefore making a very tidy profit. We also recall John D. Rockefeller, 1839 to 1937, businessman and philanthropist. And I don't think I need to even tell you what he was the head of, but in case you don't know, Standard Oil, the greatest oil empire the United States has ever known. An empire, a trust that had to be broken up. And yet he became a philanthropist. There's also Jay Koch. You may not be aware of him, a financier during the U.S. Civil War. Very, very interesting image with that intense look in his eyes, as many individuals from that time frame, well, they must have had because they were great business leaders. But how exactly do we reconcile the simultaneous rise of all these incredible business leaders and their wondrous achievements in the 1800s? Here's another interesting picture of Jay Koch, and this is apparently during the United States Civil War, and of course he has the look, with the wondrous beard included, and the nice hat picture. He's wearing a gray hat, it looks like in this image, but it should be noted he was a financier for the Union cause. And here's Koch Castle, one of his many houses that's very aptly named, I would say. What exactly is this particular house made out of? And so what am I doing in this exploration? We're really challenging the identity of who these individuals are, and we're only looking at a few. There are so many robber barons or reset barons that there's too many to name. But is the fact that they have a conflicted account already from contemporary records, in other words, some people were saying that these individuals were great revolutionary thinkers, that really they were responsible for ushering in the so-called Second Industrial Revolution in the United States. Without their business leadership, without their interests, there never would have been the development of the Great Railroad in the United States. And recall that was something that the United States, despite not inventing the railroad, official history says that it was originally started in England, or the United Kingdom at the time, the United States managed to surpass the United Kingdom in the development of the railroad. And they did this despite the fact that they had many different individuals from many different nations and many different customs speaking a wide variety of languages. And how was that achieved? Because they had these great industrial leaders, these captains of industry, these individuals whose reputations go on the spectrum of being robber barons who utilized unethical business practices to influence politicians. And yet simultaneously, they had the far-reaching goals. They had the ability, the drive, the ambition to really build this incredible American railroad empire out of nothing. And of course, it spread to other areas. It spread to steel, it spread to finance, and virtually every other thing that you can think of. Well, minus bricks, of course. We don't exactly know who the brick baron was from the 1800s. We have many different theories, but all we really have is that bricks were made in St. Louis after that nasty fire started by a steamship, and there's no reason to question that history. Indeed, many people who never witnessed the event will assure me that's what happened in the comments section, and by all means, what do you think happened? Let me know. But John D. Rockefeller of Standard Oil, an individual whose reputation and the effects of his decisions went far past his lifetime. In fact, what we understand is that these so-called robber barons, in an effort to improve their reputations, became philanthropists, and we're well aware of where Rockefeller reached into certain areas. And you may recall that when we looked at Yerkes Observatory, that of course was from another financier, Mr. Charles Yerkes, and the endowment that he left, the University of Chicago, so they could build an incredible observatory in Wisconsin. It all makes total sense. But what exactly was the reputation of these robber barons? Well, they had a darker side to their reputation, that they forced labor, that they employed child labor. There were no labor laws in the United States, and at that time it was stated that people just had to work very, very hard, to include the children. And that's what the official history says. They either worked or they faced no ability to exist in this society, in this civilization. Even though we understand that the U.S. Constitution was originally established well before the 1800s, it was, of course, modified, which we've looked at, by President Lincoln during the United States Civil War, but the base tenets of it were supposed to be the same. And here we have Henry Flagler, and you might remember he was the other great robber baron or philanthropist, depending on how you want to look at it, oligarch or philanthropist, that's the modern term for it, who built up the incredible numerous castles, hotels, that are in Florida to this day. And you might recall we explored his exploits in the St. Augustine exploration. So what was the real story, though, with these robber barons, these reset barons? Were these really business-minded individuals from humble origins, or did they have a completely different account? Could it have been possible that these were individuals that were, how shall we say, selected, that were known to facilitate this period of transition? A period of transition that followed what we may think of as a complete civilization reset. Now, how do you want to view that? Do you view that as the official history, that the reset was really more of a revolution? It was a change in technology, and the people had to be dragged into this new world, kicking and screaming, oftentimes against their will. And if you didn't have these incredible captains of industry, these robber barons or these reset barons, this never would have happened. Or could it be possible that these were the individuals that were the real leaders who were brought about to facilitate the final phase, if you will, of the last reset? To bring about a new civilization, a new society, a new order. They had the means and the resources to do it. And most importantly, they had the knowledge. Because whether you accept the mainstream official historical account, or if you believe there's an alternative account, no one argues the fact that these reset barons, or these robber barons, or these philanthropists, or however we decide to view them, were responsible for actually bringing the United States through the Second Industrial Revolution. And we've certainly explored that in our numerous looks at technological and industrial revolutions, especially with the United States. The reason the United States being so interesting is because it was really built up from nothing. It had an incredible population growth of over 1,000% from 1800 to 1900. That's what the official numbers say. And to say nothing about the details that went into the construction of the numerous railroads, the establishment of vast heavy industry, all happening very quickly in a short amount of time. Even more impressive was the destructive nature of the United States Civil War in the 1860s and the vast loss of life and the destruction of property that was associated with it. Yet despite the devastation of the U.S. Civil War, the United States officially recovered very quickly. The former Confederate States of America, reintegrated in the United States of America at the end of the Civil War, quickly rebuilt its shattered cities, and the great industry expanded across the entire nation. Again, that's what the official history will say. But is that exactly what really happened? Is that what we're really looking at when it comes to this account of these incredible Gilded Age mansions, houses, castles, palaces, whatever we want to call them? It's certain to say that we don't build structures like this today, and we have our usual slew of reasons why we don't. It's prohibitively expensive. Yes, we actually have the temerity to say and believe that things are prohibitively expensive when we spend $1 trillion as a nation assisting other nations in conflicts, and we also shut down our entire economy for over a year just 5 short years ago. Now, there were also a lot of issues with labor relations, and there was entire social breakdowns over labor disputes that occurred during the latter portion of the 1800s. There were attempts to formulate large labor movements, advocating for things such as the 8-hour workday. And perhaps you could say this favors the argument of what was happening at the time. Why would anybody accept child labor? Why would anybody accept working more than 8 hours a day or 12-hour days? And yet it was during this Gilded Age period, the tail end of this period of robber barons, that the very first skyscraper was constructed in Chicago. Sorry, New York City. Again, at least that's what the official history says. Although it seems as though there's many questionable accounts of that, because how is it that we were in a civilization that was building skyscrapers, while at the same time apparently the vast majority of the population was living in sod houses? And again, the explanation will be because they were on the frontier, of course. So, a nation that was expanding, where was its real center of gravity? Where was its true focus? Was it in the cities? Was it on the frontier? Was it really possible to do these diverging centers of gravity at the same time? Keep in mind, this was a fledgling nation. I've always found it very, very intriguing and just completely amazing that the United States, and even during its brief existence, the Confederate States of America, were able to field and equip large national armies. They were also able to pull off other amazing things. Ah yes, P.J. Kennedy, another great business leader from the 1800s. You may be aware of his grandson, John F. Kennedy, or his other grandson, Robert F. Kennedy, and we've explored the tragic legacy of his granddaughter, Rosemary Kennedy. So the business leadership, the very interesting society and civilization that came about in the 1800s, the interesting education of the native population and their integration into the new nation, the complete identity of the United States that involved everybody. Remember that these were different peoples. We had different ethnic groups, people from all over Europe, the Native Americans, and others. Terence V. Powderly, the Grand Master Workman of the Knights of Labor, and a name and a title that just rolls right off the tongue, he was one of the individuals that tried to organize labor and really bring about vast changes. Unfortunately, it wasn't to be, at least in the 1800s, and eventually his movement collapsed. And so there it was, at the end of the 1800s, the vast monopolies, the incredible works of the captains of industry. Yet they changed their reputation with the following era, what we call the Progressive Era. And yet it's interesting to note that while it seems as though the United States as a nation was built during the Gilded Age, or the Age of the Robber Baron, with the rise of natural gas and oil, and the vast fields of oil derricks everywhere across the nation, it's interesting to note, though, that their reputation was solidified during the early 1900s with the Progressive Era that followed the Gilded Age. What exactly was the true account of what happened? If you ever go back and watch a film, The Age of Innocence, with Daniel Day-Lewis, and not that I'm going to say anything about the present film that Daniel Day-Lewis is in, you'll get an idea of the kind of society at that time. And it's very intriguing trying to reconcile the reality, the existence of that particular society with what its achievements were, because we tend to see what happened with the wondrous construction of cities, while at the same time people were still living in sod houses. But what about these robber barons? Do we have any people who act like modern robber barons? Well, it's interesting to note that the creator of Star Trek, the original series, actually wrote lyrics for the original title of Star Trek. Yes, a lot of people aren't aware that there were lyrics that were never meant to be used, written all for the point of giving Gene Roddenberry 50% of the royalties, which cut composer Alexander Courage's cut in half. And you may also recall, going back to Gene Roddenberry enacting some robber baron-like tendencies, he tried to use the last episode of the second season of the original series of Star Trek to shoehorn in another series, an episode called Assignment Earth. I guess the best thing I can say about it is that it gave Terry Garr's career a start. And then, of course, there's Bruce Springsteen, rock legend, and an individual who's definitely a man of the people, and sings songs to ensure that he's looking out for the people. And you would certainly think that an individual who's dedicated his entire rock life to looking out for the common working people of America and ultimately the world, you might be surprised to know that he's also in a controversial state and acting with robber baron tendencies for charging some, how shall we say, exorbitant prices for his tickets. Well, the justification for doing this is simply because other artists are charging high amounts. This is around 2023, so why shouldn't he? And thus we have robber baron tendencies. So what changed? How did we go from a gilded age of robber barons to a progressive era where we went away from this incredible and intense labor focus for the entire civilization? From 1890 onward, we entered a period called the Progressive Era. But how did it happen? We understand the official history tells us that there were a lot of efforts to curtail this incredible focus of labor, people working vast days and working until they dropped, and then of course child labor. Although from an objective perspective, how exactly does child labor make any sense? Because children certainly could never work the hours that adults did. But as we understand it, it was simply the matter of taking advantage of labor in any way that they could. And there was also the fact that women were disenfranchised from voting in the United States. And so with these labor relations, the disenfranchisement of women and others from voting, there were a lot of grievances that needed to be addressed. And there apparently were attempts that were going on in the late 1800s. There was also another peculiar development with the United States, the sudden mentality to become a world power and annex other territories. Hawaii, Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines. Now, of course, we can look earlier in the United States history and we can see that they annexed portions of what used to be Mexico as part of Manifest Destiny, and we've already talked about the Native Americans and the unfortunate history with that. However, we see that there was a focus, though, on the United States suddenly being a world power because it challenged other world powers in the late 1890s with the so-called Spanish-American War, and then the United States occupation and insurgency in the Philippines, as it was officially called. Yet while all this was going on, this progressive era and the politicians, and I say politicians because it was not one political party that defined itself as progressive, wanted to bring about some vast changes to society. It was progressive. And that was, of course, giving women the right to vote. And the efforts, yes, give women a square deal. Everybody got a deal in the 1900s, a square deal, a fair deal, a new deal. Bust the deal, face the wheel. But what was it all really focused on? We've looked at history and we've noticed there's been quite a different series of accounts of women playing critical roles. And even though they didn't officially have the right to vote, we understand that women were in key roles as librarians, preserving knowledge. This is Ida Minerva Tarbell, a leading muckraker, progressive-minded journalist, 1857 to 1944. And a muckraker, a legitimate journalist who was questioning the efforts of these robber barons. And of course, Ida Minerva Tarbell, and I'm not making up her middle name, we know what Minerva was referring to. She came from a family in Pennsylvania that had initially started their own oil business. And of course, they had run afoul of John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil and had experienced some grievances in the way that they did business. And as a result of that, and I'm not making this up, Ida Tarbell's family, her father was actually in Iowa trying to start a settlement. He had to come back. But she wrote several books looking at the account of the Standard Oil Company. And you might also notice she was author of The Life of Abraham Lincoln and The Life of Napoleon Bonaparte. Yes, two individuals that are very historically similar. Well, no, officially they're not, I'm being facetious, but very interesting that all the accounts that we have of Abraham Lincoln's early life were from the efforts of Ida M. Tarbell researching it, to include his log cabin days, apparently. And she really pulled apart the works of Rockefeller and really exposed the business practices of Standard Oil to the vast population with her writings. She put a lot of effort into what she was doing, and another interesting note is that she wasn't exactly considered the best student, but was very intelligent. As a result of the demands on her writing, she spent a lot of time here in this Clifton Springs Sanatorium in New York. Sanatorium, asylum, is it the same thing? Well, apparently she could come and go as she pleased. But this era of this open-minded, muckraking journalist, the predecessor, if you will, to Geraldo Rivera, is what brought about the progressive era, according to official history. The main initial goal was to give women the right to vote and really end this period of disenfranchisement across the nation. After all, the Civil War was fought to end slavery, and eventually it had given African Americans the right to vote officially. But who were these progressive era politicians? Would you be surprised to know that they included both hardcore Democrats and Republicans? It even officially included socialists and other interesting leaders. So what exactly was the progressive era all about? Did it really represent a time of bipartisan cooperation in the United States? We have all these efforts of women suffragists marching for the right to vote and images that document it historically, this image being from Boone, Iowa. Very intriguing that the town was so well built up in the early 1900s with some incredible structures. But what effort did it take? I always remember this interesting relief I saw in the Iowa State Capitol. These women depicted in this image never exactly looked like women that were looking to achieve any sort of rights or required any sort of rights. They looked like they already had full rights and understanding within a society. That's just my interpretation, and perhaps it's some idealized image. This is Carrie Chapman Catt, one of the foremost women suffragist leaders and a political leader who was very active in the early 1900s and a critical leader to give women the right to vote. She had moved to Iowa when she was very young and actually attended Iowa State University, or Iowa Agricultural College as it was known during that time. And she made the very controversial move of having women suffragists embrace World War I and embodying the patriotic fervor. This was something that apparently had the entire nation see the suffragists as patriots, and of course, won favor across the nation. And it should be noted that at the conclusion of World War I, women were granted the right to vote, the main stated goal of the Progressive Era. Although there are some other interesting images, and here at the Old Main at the Iowa Agricultural College, we see what looks to be a formation of female soldiers. How very intriguing. We've looked at this image before, and I'm not exactly sure how to explain it. I always found it rather curious, though, that during the United States Civil War, you think Abraham Lincoln would have been all about having a women's Army Corps that was subsequently fielded in World War II. I mean, why not? Winning the Civil War was a critical factor. This is Cat Hall, at least the old building at Iowa State that has endured to this day. Very interesting imagery and landscape, again back when it was Iowa Agricultural College, or the Iowa Model Farm as it was really originally known as. How interesting that all these connections to Iowa always come into these explorations, and I certainly don't plan this. And here we have Cat Hall today, where the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences is located at Iowa State University, fitting in quite a way, and named after Carrie Chapman Catt. And then, of course, we have this other mechanics lab, or lab of mechanics, or whatever you want to call it, from Iowa State. I'm simply looking at this image because it's rather intriguing, some of these early images that we have of this Iowa Agricultural College that would become Iowa State University. It's also interesting to note all of its rather mainstream connections that we have to official history. The Adanazoff-Berry computer being invented at Iowa State, leading to the creation of the Colossus computer during World War II. The other interesting advents to include women's suffragist leader Carrie Chapman Catt graduating from Iowa State, or Iowa Agricultural College, and leading about to her vast rise in politics. And so this is what the Progressive Era was all about, providing freedom and rights, and being able to facilitate the nation, and breaking the rule of the robber barons, or the industrialists and all their terrifying trusts. And so they needed leaders. And who would the nation turn to? Well, you turn to those very same leaders. Yes, Andrew Carnegie, the individual who you could have considered a robber baron himself, although he's not remembered as a robber baron. He is considered one of the foremost leaders of the Progressive Era. And we're well aware of all the endowments that Mr. Carnegie had with the Carnegie Libraries and thousands, literally thousands of buildings that are attributed to him. This is Robert M. La Follette, and make sure you emphasize that La Follette quite uniquely. He was a Republican politician who was also a progressive leader in the great state of Wisconsin. And maybe the main reason I highlight him is that he bears a rather striking resemblance, especially with the hair, to director David Lynch. Maybe this is just rather a coincidence. Although I have to say the facial features don't exactly look like David Lynch, but perhaps as Robert La Follette did engage in transcendental meditation. Or maybe it would be more appropriate to say that he actually bore a more striking resemblance to a combination of David Lynch and David Lynch's well-known acting collaborator, Jack Nance, who appeared in his original film Eraserhead, and that film is quite a trip. So maybe if you combine the facial features of Jack Nance with the hair of David Lynch, then you have Robert M. La Follette. And very interesting that a progressive leader would be against alcohol. And here we have Eugene Debs. Yes, the great socialist leader. A socialist was actually considered a leader in the Progressive Era. Don't you find that fascinating? And I think that's the most interesting detail about the Progressive Era. Even though we've always had our great political divide in the United States between the Republicans and the Democrats, the official Progressive Era started really with William McKinley, the president who met a very unfortunate end at the World's Fair in Buffalo. And yet a lot of his policies, the initial conduct of the Spanish-American War, the annexation of Cuba, the eventual establishment of the United States as world power started under his administration. But yet William Jennings Bryan, the primary Democratic challenger for president, even though he never actually won the presidency, was also considered a Progressive Era leader. So on opposite ends of the party. And you can certainly see how he plays a good role in history. But what about other political leaders? President Taft. And I always remember that story about President Taft going down to that very interesting meeting that he had in Mexico, in Juarez, and you can actually hear a telling of that story if you watch the film Sicario. But yet, despite the fact that he was a Republican, he was also considered a member of the Progressive Era. And then there's Teddy Roosevelt, the individual who started off as a Republican, but then started his own political party, the Progressive Party. And granted, he did not win the presidency after starting his own party, but he did enable a Democrat to finally take office in the United States as president, that being Woodrow Wilson. And that's what the official history says. A little interesting note about Woodrow Wilson, he was actually a citizen of the Confederate States of America, although he was a child when the Civil War happened. And he was a Democrat, yet he was also considered a Progressive Era leader. And he brought in a lot of these sweeping changes. Here's his residency when he was at Princeton. What a very lovely structure that it is. But how did all this happen? What was really the goal of the Progressive Era? Well, we understand the goal was to provide women the vote, to achieve the universal suffrage that was sought after. Another interesting historical note, though, is that Herbert Hoover, a Republican, was also considered a member of the Progressive Era leadership. Yes, very, very interesting. Now you can see why I had so many questions for my department chair back in the day. There were things that just didn't seem to make a lot of sense to me, but maybe I was asking too many questions. Another little detail is the establishment of the Commission on Training Camp Activities, a Progressive Era doctrine. And this came about when the United States was fielding its first true national army to fight in World War I, and it talks about health and why health is so important. Health is even more important than military training. Training is useless without health. And these series of programs also brought about, how shall we say, the socialization of the American soldier in World War I. It also went about establishing that national identity that all individuals took with them when they finished their military service. How intriguing that there wasn't an account of this during the United States Civil War. Well, of course there wasn't. They were volunteer militia units. There was also the interesting establishment of the treatment of juveniles. Here from this particular individual in the great city of Denver, which we've looked at before, the Honorable Ben B. Lindsay. And he's credited with being the father of juvenile court. And so a very strange occurrence, a series of details with the passage of these three critical amendments to the U.S. Constitution, the goals of the progressives. And here we have the thing that they considered most important because they passed it first. Article 16, Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes on incomes, the United States federal income tax. And how did the United States accept this initially? Well, you can see that at that time, unless you made $20,000 or about $600,000 a year, you were only paying 1% taxes on your income. And so you could see how that would be a lot more acceptable to the people at that time. Now you're probably asking the question, well, why don't we still pay 1% income tax? The answer is that during World War II, the United States was caught by surprise at Pearl Harbor. There was a surprise attack by the Japanese, and the United States, despite its best efforts to avoid getting involved in World War II, they were suddenly dragged into it. And Germany also declared war on the United States after Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. The Japanese also managed to surprise the United States Far Eastern Air Force in the Philippines 10 hours later after the attack on Pearl Harbor due to a series of controversial events, although there's never been any definitive conclusion how the Far East Air Force was caught by surprise in the Philippines 10 hours later. But whatever, the fact that the United States military was in a very defensive posture in the Pacific conflict that had been drawn into by the surprise attack from the Japanese. Of course, it should be noted that the Japanese were unable to surprise the Soviet Union. In the battles of Khalkhin Gol, the Soviet Union had sent their best commander Zhukov and armor mech divisions to utterly destroy the Japanese army, or at least defeat it quite badly. However, the United States was caught by surprise numerous times, and nobody could possibly see a war coming, although fortunately the United States was able to convert from a pre-war economy to an industrialized war economy. And in effect, it also established a program of taxation. It expanded taxation. And you can see here with the real GDP growth, the black line, and then the gray shaded area being the amount of taxation collected during World War II. 4 million registered taxpayers went up to 40 million during the 1940s and World War II. And thus this brought about the construction of the great American military machine to win World War II. And that is the story of how the United States accepted income tax rates. And we'll see exactly what that culminated into this day. But I always found it very interesting that all these incredible things that were built, the ships, the planes, the tanks, the infinite amounts of rifles and machine guns to bring about a successful conclusion to World War II, that by the end of the war, the United States had so much equipment that they ended up throwing it into the ocean in many places because, well, it was cheaper than bringing it back to the nation and preserving it for future conflicts. That's an interesting history. And of course, today you'll see that federal income taxes now are 10% for anybody making under $11,601 today. And once you're over that, you're getting taxed 12%. And of course, we can read into the history of how that happened and understand that it was all a very legal process. Yet going back to when the Progressive Era brought this all about, the political cartoons, and I'd never seen this one before, showing Woodrow Wilson as a pharaoh figure, if you will, that was really dragging the entire nation along with these Progressive Era changes. And it was during the Progressive Era and the administration of Woodrow Wilson that the amendment, the 16th Amendment, was passed. Subsequently, there was also the passage of the 18th Amendment, where prohibition, or the restriction on the use of alcohol anywhere in the United States, was passed. Yes, you'll notice that the state of Wisconsin resisted it. I guess Robert La Follette didn't have that kind of pull. And here we have it, the amendment itself. Another amendment to the Constitution. After 1 year from the ratification of this article, the manufacture, sale, or transportation of intoxicating liquors within the importation thereof or exportation in the United States subject to jurisdiction. Yes. And then finally, as almost as though it was the least priority of the amendments, they passed the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote. And so interesting how this chronological unfolding of these amendments to the great United States Constitution brought about our current modern era. Some people view this as a rather overreaction to the statements and actions of these robber barons. And yet, half of these robber barons or more became designated philanthropists who supported this progressive era. So what do you think really happened? Was this all just natural history? Or is there a deeper story in this, especially with these leaders, these individuals that we call both robber barons and philanthropists?
Today, we're going to be exploring the reset theories, the transitions from the old world to Tartaria to today. This exploration is going to link back into the grand theories of the old world and Tartaria and time paradox videos that I did earlier in the channel's history. I'll provide links to those in the description. But the reason I wanted to explore the reset theories is currently in the stage of exploration the channel's in, I felt it important to be able to illustrate and depict what may have happened and how the world went from being what we believed it used to be to what the world is today. There's a lot of imagery as you look in history and myth and even in things that we find more genuine or things that we pretend to believe in and other things that we do legitimately believe in, where we see pictures and images of destruction, fire raining down from the sky, the entire world flooded, vast tsunamis, or fire and brimstone as one of the sayings for it would go. Why do we have this in what we would call our collective conscience? And what is our collective conscience? What's the difference between our collective conscience and our individual conscience? Well, collective conscience revolves around the concept of memes. And memes are just things that we see that are represented in different ways that may mean slightly different things to different people, but a particular meaning is assigned to them, and that tends to go from person to person. Whereas with your individual thoughts and beliefs, these are something, and it's something that's important to retain. And why is that? Because your ability to be an individual and your ability to see things your own unique way in the world is one of the most particular ways that you define yourself. Now, am I arguing that you need to be away from groups or anything like that? No, not at all. I'm simply distinguishing between what collective conscience and individual conscience is. And it's important as we go forward with these explorations to understand the differences. And this particular video is going to focus on both, because we see how both concepts are used. We have many images of destruction, and The theme of this video is not to be fear, although we certainly know that fear is used, and it's used repetitively and frequently in many different aspects of our modern society, but it's something that's always been with us throughout all time. And as you look at this image here, I'm sure you can guess what era that this supposed destruction is from. Hint, it's not from the past. So this goes back to our 5 eras theory, the old world in Tartaria. And again, this is just my supposition on this. There could be something completely different. There are many other ways to view this, and it's not to say that my theory is right. That's why I call it a theory. But I believe that in the past, we were in a golden age, and there were many different aspects to it where we could build amazing buildings. We had a remarkable society, and we even had increased longevity, creativity, inspiration, and self-reliance. We went through some challenging phases, and we'll call those resets. And of course, we're also going to have to define what I mean by a reset. And that transitioned us into the Tartarian age, and that is the civilization that preceded ours. That's what we refer to it on this channel. Now, that's not to say that's the only term for it. Is that what that previous civilization was called? Who knows? It could be listed in the Voynich manuscript in language we can't even read, for all we know. Or the Voynich manuscript could just be a forgery, and it's just something to mislead us. So we have to keep open minds, and it's why we have to compare different theories and different aspects. And then that transitions to the contemporary age. Now, the resets in the distant past are something that are a little more difficult to define, whereas the most recent reset, and keep in mind these are hard resets. Well, what do I mean by hard resets? Hard resets are where we have a total change to the societal paradigm. In other words, we change everything from how the society, the culture, the perception, if you will, of our entire existence is completely changed. And it could involve languages, most likely it does. And looking at the 5 eras theory timeline here, and as those of you who've watched my previous videos know, I am more on the facet with the 1850 time frame being the likely year that the last reset occurred. Now, is that final set in stone? No, it could have been 1800, it could have been in 1750. And as we go through this video, you'll see evidence for both. So that's why I keep it on the table. And I haven't encountered anything that's changed that aspect of categorizing those theories. But what we really want to look at is how we went from the 3 distinct eras of the Golden Age. And there's other ways to phrase the eras of the Golden Age. I've heard it called the Golden, Silver, and Bronze Age, or what have you. And I think it was John Levi who said the contemporary age is called the Plastic Age. Very appropriate. But in any event, we want to look at how we went from this to where we could build amazing structures and we had a remarkable society and increased longevity to what we have now with our wonderful, creatively inspired buildings that are block-like. And of course, people like Harrison Pates and Zach at Bloomberg will tell us that we're crazy for wanting to aspire to more. And I can't imagine why they would want us to think that. So perhaps I shouldn't be too hard on them. So let's get into it. The first reset from the Golden Age. And the first reset is always back to what many people call the flood myth. Now, I don't think it's a myth because there are too many examples of the flood being found in different civilizations, different historical contexts, and there's a lot of evidence. And even science, and I mean actual science, not the dogmatic practice of what they call science, but real science, does give indications that there was a worldwide flood that occurred. Now, of course, they always use the term biblical, and typically biblical has become an adjective to say that something is really, 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 really bad. But in any event, the flood that occurred in the first era of the Golden Age was truly a world-changing event. And it was something that had even the mountains under the water. Now, as to what caused it or what was behind it, a deity, something else, we don't know. We do have very clear indications that it happened, and I'm certainly open to many different possibilities because who knows how long ago this was? Was this a couple thousand years ago? Was it longer? Was it shorter? Not sure, don't know, many different theories. But I don't believe that we can ignore all the accounts that we have of a great flood occurring. And this is a flood that is beyond our ability to imagine right now. I mean, we're always talking about tsunamis and mega tsunamis, and yes, those do come up in subsequent resets. But this is a flood that clearly had all of the land that we know of submerged for a time. It looks like there was nothing that was above this flood for a while, and it was truly a reset. It completely wiped out the civilization, the society, the languages of the past. Now we go to the second reset from the Golden Age. And this was clearly the time when we had the Tower of Babel. Babel, however you want to say it. The Tower of Babel is a very impressive story that does come from many biblical accounts, but it also resonates with us in many different ways. And here's the reason why. It's not just the destruction of the great structure of the Tower of Babel, and that really inspires our imagination that once humanity was unified, spoke a single language, and it was able to build a structure that reached to the very sky, or the heavens, as I said at that time. And the account tells us that because a deity was offended, they'll say God or whatever, that the tower had to be destroyed, and if people were unified in speech and purpose, there's no telling what they could accomplish, so therefore they were confused, and it completely changed their speech and purpose. Now, who knows if this was the actual cause and effect, or if this was just myth? Again, I'm just relaying the stories as they're stated. I'm not trying to tell you what to believe. But I think there is something with this in the fact that there was a story that humanity was once unified, and then after this event, it was no longer unified. Now, could this have included more than this? Could this have involved potentially fire from the sky or plasma fire raining down? Yes, absolutely. And it could have involved destruction beyond our ability to imagine, because we do see many structures that look like they've been just completely and totally melted. And there are many theories that indicate and show, even to this day, you can see structures that have been melted. Older structures, and yet details still exist that show that they were made artificially by human beings. The third reset from the Golden Age. So this is where we progress into what they would call the Bronze Age, or the third era of the Golden Age, as I call it. And this is the era that I believe that we had star forts, that we had other amazing structures, very likely the era that the pyramids were constructed in. Again, I could be completely wrong. This is just my theory. And the reset from this last era of the Golden Age was probably very similar. Again, fire from the sky, plasma fire, perhaps to a lesser extent. But then also including major earthquakes and tsunamis. And what brought about these major earthquakes or tsunamis? Was this just something that the land happened naturally, or was this induced by some powerful figure? We don't know. We have many theories, and we have myth that'll tell us what it's all about, and you can find many different examples of it in the myth. For example, the Tuatha De Danann in Ireland supposedly had the ability to control the weather. And for those of us in the Midwest of the United States wondering why it's so cold right now, this late in April, we don't wonder if someone's controlling the weather, but it's just something fun to consider. Nevertheless, the end of the third era of the Golden Age, and really the ending of the Golden Age, was something that probably involved multiple disasters at the same time. And I show the fairy chimneys from Cappadocia because I think that's great evidence of what were once amazing structures and amazing buildings that were melted by some unbelievable force, whether it was plasma fire or something else that we can't fully understand. It's clear that those structures are there. Now, remember that the mainstream will tell us that these fairy chimneys were created naturally by the forces of erosion and other causes they love to reiterate. But then we have this, Ukasar Castle, near the same area, in fact, which they say was a castle. It was a Byzantine castle that was eroded. Just instead of over millions of years, it was only over about 1,000 years. Yet it looks exactly the same. So, again, not telling you what to think or what to believe, just relating the accounts and just showing the similarities in images. Come to your own conclusions. Now the fourth reset from Tartaria, or the civilization that preceded ours. On the channel, we talked about how that civilization may have ended, where we have many images of people being gathered. Now, a lot of people say that, well, this is simply large-scale emigration and immigration, people moving from one nation to another. And yet, you have different connotations to it when you see large gatherings of people. You almost get the feeling that this is an industrial-wide movement of people, where people were no longer considered people, they were considered human resources. In any event, Many images of people being gathered up and moved, and what could it have led to? Well, it could have led to some people being told that there was going to be world ending events coming and they had to go to a place of safety. Perhaps domes, like we saw in Logan's Run, or perhaps some other structure that they had built that they were told that they would be safe. And we do have images and indications that there were geodesic domes in the past. Can't prove it, but there were indications that there may have been. However, the unlucky ones were taken to the underground, and we know what has been speculated to have happened in the underground. Certainly nothing good to anybody. Whether they were tormented or they were changed in some way beyond our ability to understand. And yes, I'm still going to use this theory because it comes up a little too often in myth and, yes, even history of how people were tormented underground. And we do have evidence of many, many skeletons and human remains in vast catacombs across the land. So I'm still continuing with this theory. Maybe disproven, and I'm certainly open to it being disproven. And finally, looking at the last reset, where we really went from the Tartarian civilization to ours, there are 5 major events that we can highlight and look at. One is the Great Peshtigo Fire. The next is the New Madrid earthquake, the Year Without a Summer, fires in many major cities, and wars across the land. These were all events that occurred through the 19th century, and we're told that these events occurred in very different times, and they're separated by a number of years. But what if these events occurred a lot closer together than we're told? What if all these events happened within a 1 to 2 year time frame, and then our picture, the story that we're told, is changed? We are given the impression that these events occurred across a great swath of time, extended even to 50 to 75 to 100 years. Well, let's look into each one of these events and see what the mainstream tells us about them. Let's look at the Peshtigo Fire first. The Peshtigo Fire was a large forest fire on October 8, 1871 in northeastern Wisconsin, United States, including much of the southern half of the Door Peninsula and adjacent parts of the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. The largest community in the affected area was Peshtigo, Wisconsin, which had a population of approximately 1,700 residents. The fire burned about 1.2 million acres and is the deadliest wildfire in recorded history, with the number of deaths estimated between 1,500 and 2,500. Although the exact number of deaths is debated, mass graves, both those already exhumed and those still being discovered in Peshtigo and the surrounding areas, show that the death toll of the blaze was most likely greater than the 1889 Johnstown flood death toll of 2,200 people or more. Here's the keynote. Occurring on the same day as the more famous Great Chicago Fire, the Peshtigo Fire has been largely forgotten, even though it killed far more people. In total, the Great Chicago Fire took 1/5 as many lives as the Peshtigo Fire. Everybody's heard about the Chicago Fire, and that got all the publicity at the time, said a volunteer at the Peshtigo Fire Museum named Ruth Wiltzius, whose great-grandfather perished while trying to escape. Couple generations separation there, but okay. Peshtigo was a backwards lumber town then. Who had ever heard of it? Chicago was the big city. Which one was going to get more attention? Nonetheless, several cities in Michigan, including Holland and Manistee across Lake Michigan from Peshtigo and Port Huron at the southern end of Lake Huron, also had major fires on the same day. These fires, along with many other fires of the 19th century, had the same basic causes: small fires coupled with unusually dry weather. So they're referring to dry weather, and it is very interesting when you consider the fact that both the Peshtigo Fire and the areas that it said that it affected and Chicago just happened to be on the same line of longitude or very close to it. I'm sure that's yet another coincidence. But yes, it happened on the exact same day as the Great Chicago Fire, but because of separate causes, which they will persist to this day. And it's funny how you always get a different story as to what originally started the Great Chicago Fire. Even when you go to Chicago, they'll tell you different stories about what caused it. Let's go to the New Madrid earthquakes. The 1811-1812 New Madrid earthquakes were a series of intense intraplate earthquakes, beginning with an initial earthquake of moment magnitude 7.2 to 8.2 on December 16, 1811, followed by a moment magnitude 7.4 aftershock on the same day. Very precise measurements. I wonder how they were able to get those precise measurements. And of course, they don't tell us here that this is an estimate. They come across as though they know. Science. Two additional earthquakes of similar magnitude followed in January and February 1812. They remain the most powerful earthquakes to hit the contiguous United States east of the Rocky Mountains in recorded history. The earthquakes, as well as the seismic zone of their occurrence, were named for the Mississippi River town of New Madrid, then part of the Louisiana Territory and now within the U.S. state of Missouri. The epicenters of the earthquakes were located in an area that at the time was at the distant western edge of the American frontier, only sparsely settled by European settlers. Contemporary accounts have led seismologists to estimate that those stable continental region earthquakes were felt strongly throughout much of the central and eastern United States, across an area of roughly 50,000 square miles, and moderately across nearly 3 million kilometers squared, or 1 million square miles. The 1906 San Francisco earthquake, by comparison, was felt moderately over roughly 6,200 square miles, or 16,000 square kilometers. The New Madrid earthquakes were interpreted variously by American Indian tribes, but one consensus was universally accepted. The powerful earthquake had to have meant something. For many tribes in Tecumseh's Pan-Indian alliance, it meant that Tecumseh and his brother the Prophet must be supported. First I've heard of that one. So a lot of interesting accounts of this. And of course, another account from this particular earthquake was that it had the Mississippi River flowing north instead of its usual southern direction. So again, another account of a horrific disaster. And of course, they have it tied into what they tell us were historical events at the time. You know, one thing I always wondered is how did the tribes in Tecumseh's Pan-Indian Alliance have such great communication? I mean, it's impressive what they achieved, but I just always wondered how they did it. Oh well, no matter. Moving on. Year without a summer. The year 1816 is known as the year without a summer because of severe climate abnormalities that caused average global temperatures to decrease by 0.4 to 0.7 degrees Celsius, or 0.7 to 1 degree Fahrenheit. Huge changes there. Summer temperatures in Europe were the coldest of any on record between the years of 1766 and 2000. I didn't know that we had very explicit weather records from those years. Again, it's just like the Richter scale. It's remarkable the amount of scientific detail that we had from eras where we were supposedly not recording specific scientific detail. Nevertheless, this resulted in major food shortages across the Northern Hemisphere. Funny, you don't really hear anything in U.S. history about major food shortages, but maybe it was suppressed for political reasons. Let's go with that. Evidence suggests that the anomaly was predominantly a volcanic winter event caused by the massive 1815 eruption of Mount Tambora in April in the Dutch East Indies, known today as Indonesia. This eruption was the largest in at least 1,300 years, again, after the hypothesized eruption causing the volcanic winter of, 536. Yes, that's right, the worst year to be alive. But wait a minute, they say it's a hypothesized eruption? So wait a minute, was it hypothesized or was it really the worst year to be alive? No, well, I'll consult all the other YouTube channels that talk about it relentlessly and see what they say. Might be interesting. Its effect in the climate may have been exacerbated by the 1814 eruption of Mayon in the Philippines. So again, here you have three different events that supposedly occurred in very different times across decades, across most of the entire 19th century, and yet they seem to be connected. Well, let's look at all of our city fires that we have, and these are just the ones that they have listed. I can assure you there are many more fires that occurred. We got the Great Fire of 1805 Detroit, we got the Great Fire of Podil in Kiev, we got the Fire of Moscow, we've got Buffalo, New York, I mean everything, St. John's, Newfoundland, Great Fire of Turku in Finland, Augusta, Georgia, Fayetteville in North Carolina. Oh, look at that. Fayetteville comes up twice, 1821 and then 10 years later. Is that a repeated fire? Fayetteville, North Carolina is close to where Fort Bragg, a very large military installation, is today. Interesting. Oh, look at that. Charleston, South Carolina. We've come across that in our explorations before when we were looking at the U.S. Civil War. The Great New York City Fire of 1845, 345 buildings destroyed. Great Fire of Pittsburgh, Great Fire of Newfoundland again. Great Fire of Bucharest, the St. Louis Fire of 1849, the first Great Fire of Toronto, 1849. Poland. Oh, San Francisco. Look at that. 1851. Just a few short years, and they'd already built 2,000 buildings to be destroyed by that fire. Boy, San Francisco's just had it rough. Great Montreal Fire, the Great Fire of Newcastle. Oh, gosh, it just keeps going on. New Zealand, Brisbane, Portland. We're not even to the 1870s yet. And then, of course, the Great Chicago Fire, the Peshtigo Fire. Remember, these were separate events, and they were not connected, even though they occurred on the same day. There's the Great Boston Fire, another Chicago Fire. Oh, why not? The Great Fire of Hong Kong, Calgary, Vancouver, All these fires. The Great Bakersfield Fire. Makes me wonder what was in Bakersfield. I've been through that town before. It's right in the middle of the Mojave, right in between Los Angeles and Las Vegas. And again, and these don't even begin to scratch the surface of all the great fires. So there's that. Lots of great fires and lots of damage, and it's worldwide, or across the land or the realm or whatever you want to call it. Now let's look at the list of wars and conflicts from 1800 to 1899. You might be surprised in terms of how many there are. You know, we always think about the Napoleonic Wars, the Crimean War, and the United States Civil War as the major conflicts, but when you actually go through this, and I'm not going to read all of these because this is a very extensive list. Yeah, we're just getting out of the first decade of the 19th century and the second decade. Lots of wars, lots of conflicts. Just a huge list. And we're finally to the third decade. More wars, and of course they'll say it was a mutiny, it was a revolt, it was this or that. We have so many different names for them, but bottom line up front, it just gives you the impression that there's fighting going on all over the world, and it is nonstop. It's not just the Napoleonic Wars, it's not just the United States Civil War. There's mutinies, revolts, all over the place, and it really gives you the impression that conflict played a major role in the 19th century. And yet they say the world wars occurred in the 20th century. Well, maybe both are true, maybe none of it's true. But in any event, when you look at all five of these accounts, you get the feeling that there's a lot more to the 19th century, and it really supports the fact that there was a true hard reset. So it's clear looking at these five categories of events that all supposedly transpired in the 19th century that we have a lot of evidence and many clues to a hard reset occurring. Now, our current society loves to throw about the term that this is a reset for this is a reset for that, there's going to be a financial reset. My theory on that is they just like to stoke fear, because fear and uncertainty are very good ways to keep people uncertain and to keep people more dependent on authority. And whatever that authority is, it doesn't really matter. But there's a reason why I don't like to refer to some group as controllers, and I prefer to just refer to them as entities, archons, or some other sort of influence, because I don't believe that they have any sort of true control and that they can orchestrate any of these major hard resets. I think they just simply have a little bit more knowledge and they take advantage of it. I may be proven wrong, but I just thought I would state that. And of course, I threw out this little image here because we always hear the warning of hell on earth because there'll be a great famine, and we're supposed to count on these amazing public figures to do something about it. And of course, that's constantly repeated, and you've seen it repeated ad nauseum over the last few years, especially. And it'll be something different next year and the year after that. But again, it's just threats. And I think a lot of it is they're referring to things that remain in our collective conscience, our fear of fire, our fear of destruction, our fear of the end of the world, as it were. But I don't propose this video to generate fear. It's just simple awareness and to understand what's really going on. I do believe that some of these events do remain in our collective conscience for various reasons. Yes, they may have happened in the past, but even if there was some portent of doom coming, there's no reason to live in fear. Live your life and make each day the most of it, whether you know or you don't know what's going to come tomorrow. There's actually a lot of freedom in not knowing exactly what's going to come from tomorrow. And of course, people like to put a lot of derision on that word, but I think every individual being able to make their own way in life and finding what's best for them, so long as they don't harm others, is one of the most ideal states of existence. That's just my personal belief. Take it or leave it. And of course, I go back to the evidence that we have. This is Ukasar Castle back in Turkey, and they tell us that this was a castle, and yet it looks just like the nearby fairy chimneys of Cappadocia. It's quite fascinating that they try to pass that off, and I'm not sure why. But you can clearly see that it was subjected to some sort of great forces, whether it was fire from the sky, a plasma rain, or something we can't understand. It did happen. I'm not buying the fact that they say that it was natural erosion and this was a Byzantine castle and this is what happened to it over 1,000 years. Because these are the fairy chimneys of Cappadocia. I don't think there's really any difference. So, again, just awareness, and by all means, if you have a dissenting opinion or if you have a different theory, by all means, let me know in the comments. I'm open to different thoughts and ideas, and I certainly want to continue to either validate or disprove these theories. That's what this is all about. Research and exploration. And whatever you do, just don't check into a place where you can check out, but you can never leave. check into a place where you can check out and you can leave. It's important to have that.
Welcome, channel members, and without further ado, I'm going to let you know the secret location of the Old World Library is at Milk Abbey in Austria. You'll see that it's founded in 1089. Now, the actual detailed investigation that led to understanding the location of where the true Old World Library is, and no, it's not the V in Rome, it's actually here in Milk, Austria, will be available to Prime Explorers. Now, I'm just going to explain why I'm doing this. It's because I feel that Prime Explorers, I've not been able to really get the early releases working too well on the channel, and for whatever reason I've had all kinds of technical difficulties. So everyone will have access to this video, but I'm going to send out a special post just to Prime Explorers. You can talk to me direct via email and ask me what the line of investigation was that led to this conclusion that the actual Old World Library is hidden in Milk Abbey in Austria. Now, it does go back to the earlier video from last week, the Old World Libraries, and namely starting with the library in Alexandria. There's a lot of indications that library did truly exist, and it did perish in a great fire. And the reason that you can look into this is because in the end of the 20th century, in a lot of academic circles, it was widely agreed upon that that library perished in a fire. Well, then once we came around to the 21st century with a bit of the change, it seems to have been reformed quite a bit in terms of what actually happened. You know, one of those abilities that we have to look back into history 1,000 years before we're here now and determine that different events occurred, which I've always found quite laughable. It's not as though we could talk to first-hand sources, and it was asking those kind of questions that started to get me into trouble with my department chair when I was at the university. So I wanted to share this with you and just enjoy the beautiful views of Milk Abbey. And it's definitely a building that doesn't make a lot of sense, and you can research the historical account of it on your own, but what you'll find is it was founded, yes, they use that word, in the 11th century before the First Crusade. They also tell us that the current structure was built at the start of the 18th century. So once again, even though you have this more elaborate storied history or line of history, a number of years that exists in Europe, they oftentimes go with the same explanations that most of the incredible older buildings are all from 1700 and newer. There's a couple older castles that you'll see, and then when they have a little bit of difficulty trying to explain the elaborate, ornate detail in the architecture, they'll say, well, it was a royal family that had infinite money and infinite resources, and it was this rich family, or it was this pious bout of devotion to the worship of God that led to the construction of this incredible edifice in the middle of nowhere. You'll find these same stories across the United States and Europe. The only thing that differs is the timeline. With Milk Abbey, though, you'll see that there's a little something different with its beautiful decorative detail. And yes, I know I use that adjective a lot because one of the things that I was trained to be as a lecturer is that there's certain adjectives that you use over and over again. Look, since you're the channel members, you get a little bit more of an inside view into my thoughts. And what you should really know about me is that I'm somebody who always tries to find a different exploration behind an explanation. I was never willing to accept the explanations that were given to us as fact because when you start to compare facts from different sources, you'll find that there's too many discrepancies to ignore. The account of Milk Abbey, you have numerous discrepancies. We're told that the abbey was destroyed by fire on multiple occasions. We're told that the abbey suffered from plague and numerous other factors that caused its decline. Yet somehow the physical structure managed to survive. Somehow this abbey still stands today. But the real jewel of this abbey is its library. And the account was actually relayed by an author who had found out exactly what had happened and managed to piece together the overall story. Now, that overall story did not appear in the film that we discussed in the exploration last week, but it did appear in the novel. And Prime Explorers, when you contact me, if you're so inclined to, we can discuss exactly how that state of affairs came about and what's the background with the author, and I can also share some insider academic information with you that verifies that story is true. Now, could this insider academic information all be fabrications? Could it all be lies? Absolutely. But there's a few too many consistencies to ignore, and a few too many things that just happen to fall in place perfectly for the account to be fabricated. There's just something about many of these structures, though, and we haven't really gotten to Europe yet, with the exception of a few explorations, namely Malta and St. Petersburg, where we've seen some of the more decorative detail. And we'll be told that all these incredible achievements were done well before the Industrial Revolution, which is what our favored defenders of the mainstream narrative like to point to in terms of how all these achievements in the United States were pulled off in the 19th century. But when you look at the founding or the quote-unquote construction date for these elaborate edifices across Europe, you don't have that excuse. So what's really going on with Milk Abbey? Well, in sharing with channel members, Milk Abbey was a true surviving outpost from the old world. A lot of the monasteries and a lot of the abbeys are exactly that. They were the outposts that were designed to preserve knowledge. Now, why do you explain these outposts being allowed to survive to this day? Because the current powers that be, or the current agenda that's pushing the land towards whatever it wants, understood that these were the centers of knowledge and learning, and that these were the places to be controlled. And then you'll ask the question, well, why isn't it in the V in Rome? And you're probably also asking, well, why are you talking in code? Why don't you just say it? Because there's certain word associations that you cannot use that'll have certain attention brought to the videos. And I'll admit to all of you, my intention on these videos is to try to reach as many people as possible. Am I going to make certain compromises to do that? Yes. But am I going to compromise the creative integrity behind the videos or the actual spirit of exploration to do that? No. And I'm admitting to all of you, I could very easily play the game and toe the line on the quote-unquote algorithms or the AI or whatever's really driving the nature behind the videos, but I'm not going to do that. Because I feel that if you start to cater to certain things, then those certain things will start to control your initiatives, and it's one of the reasons why I left the university system. Yes, I could have very easily been one of the youngest chairs at a university history department if I wanted to, and I'm not saying that to brag about myself. It was merely a fortunate series of events, and when I saw that I would have been compromising the search for knowledge and the objective search for truth, I refused to do it. Not to mention, once you start to look into some of these things and you see how very poorly these stories are constructed and how they don't stand up to any kind of scrutiny, and it's so obvious it's not even funny. When you look at the pulpit back there in the back left corner, does it really make any sense why there would be such an elaborate pulpit? Just asking a simple question like that. Or why you have decorative details such as this in what's supposed to be an abbey? Now we'll be told by the Catholic Church that the Benedictine order was an order that didn't necessarily believe in poverty, and the fact that when you watch the film The Name of the Rose, that's one of the central themes is the debate in the church between whether the clergy could be impoverished or not. And I even remember Sean Connery's derogatory remark towards the church providing scraps of food, and you saw that they were really rotting scraps to the unfortunate poor people that were living outside the abbey. So what's it really boil down to? It all comes down to the fact that we all have to decide exactly what's important to us. And maybe all of you will come to different conclusions than I do about these explorations. And you know what? That's perfectly okay. And in fact, I welcome that. I'm not doing these explorations to try to force people to think a certain way. Really, all I prefer is just that everybody asks their own questions and they're not afraid to explore things that don't make sense or that there's inconsistencies. Perhaps one of the things that we're not encouraged to do through action and through reinforced incentivization, whether it's monetary or simple social approval, which seems to be the two most powerful that we see in our current society, you are detracted from asking questions. You are encouraged to simply accept things as they are. And one of the other things that we see in our society a lot is a lot of recursion. And wow, has recursion gotten just unbelievably crazy since the 21st century. And what do I mean by recursion? Simply the same things appearing over and over again in pop culture. And you'll even find that you can be a very successful content creator in any platform, not just this one, just by simply keeping things at a very surface level. Just by not seeking explanations, by not positing theories, just by constantly going over the same things over and over again. And you're probably asking, well, why is that reinforced? It's acceptable to have alternative research. And the reality is, I believe that alternative research was actually something that did come from the mainstream. It's always been around. But I think the intention behind it was subverted because people were willing to ask questions. People were willing to go outside of the lines of what was incentivized. Or in other words, they weren't doing what they were supposed to do. The reality is if you concede and if you do what you're supposed to do, you're never really going to get anywhere in life. Yes, you can amass a lot of physical possessions, a lot of material possessions, and I'm not going to degrade anybody, and I'm not going to question or denigrate any other content creators for whatever approach they take. I mean, we all have our own path in this life, and we all have to do what we feel is right. And I'm simply doing what I feel is right. And what I feel is right is to share this abbey with you, to share its exact location, and to let you know that this library, yes, there's probably something great located in the V in Rome, there's no doubt about it. But I believe the true Old World library is located in Milk, Austria. This would be the most sensible place to hide it from a lot of prying eyes, and oftentimes it's easy to hide things in plain sight. There's a lot of tourism aspects towards Austria and even educational aspects that will initially draw you to Milk, but then once you start to look into it, you'll find that they'll try to direct you to other abbeys very subtly. They'll say, well, this abbey, and we're looking at pictures of the Milk Abbey, and this is one of the incredible stairways that's actually between the library and other accesses to the abbey. They'll tell you that it's just kind of a boring abbey. Yes, doesn't it just look like a really boring place? And there's a lot of people that could walk through a building like this, and they would be very bored. One of the interesting things about mainstream history is oftentimes people repute it to be very boring. And yet, conversely, a lot of people are very uniquely interested in it. And suddenly when you start to have alternative research and you consider the Milk Abbey Library, and these are the official photos of the Milk Abbey Library. And I'll just let you know from personal experience, there's a lot more to this library than meets the eye. But once again, for the Prime Explorers, you're welcome to contact me on email, and I'll put that down on a public post, and we can discuss it, and I can share some of the insider information with you about how you can verify that there is a unique library at Milk. Because they're more than happy to tell everyone that there's a library there, and they'll share these pictures of the library, but they don't want you to think there's anything special about it. Because like many other things, it's simply hidden in plain sight. And as we've learned doing these alternative explorations that we've done, it's always most effective to hide things in plain sight. If it doesn't look like someone's hiding something, then what's unique or special about it? When something seems to be hidden, though, and everybody talks about how there might be this great repository of knowledge in this one location, it's probably not the great repository you think it is. It may be, and you could simply be outthinking yourself, but it's amazing how very simple ploys and approaches tend to be very effective. So do you really have to engage in a deep, overcomplicated deception? Or can it simply be a simple deception based on repetition that's most effective? Those are thoughts that I leave with you, and I certainly invite all the comments and feedback from all of you on what your thoughts on this really are. And if you think I'm completely in left field or wrong about the great repository of actual old world knowledge being at Milk, then let me know. And I'll certainly discuss it with anybody. It's just the actual sources will be the things that I'll share with the Prime Explorers. One of the final things that I'll say, though, about this library is that if you are ever able to gain access to certain libraries, and I'll give you another clue, there are many public libraries across the land that do actually have remnants of old world works in them, and you can find them in certain copies of certain books that have been handed down. I certainly invite you to make sure that you catalog that which you read and you learn. And whether you write it down or whether you commit it to memory, it's the most important thing that it does give you a very different view of the world. And one of the things that seems to have changed about the world, the land, or whatever this existence is that we live in, is the fact that in the past, it seems as though people were encouraged to be more balanced individuals. And in this current existence, however we ended up in it, people are encouraged to be more, how shall we say, extreme on one end of the spectrum or the other. There's a lot of polarization that occurs. And it's interesting that there's a lot of warnings that you can find in fiction about what happens with extreme polarization. How it doesn't just lead to terrifying and violent outcomes, but also the fact that it is a very easy and simplistic way to control a vast amount of the population. We've had many direct conflicts since the end of World War II. And I ask you to look back on them and ask how many of those conflicts were actually decisive. How many of those really changed anything, whether from a political, economic, or military perspective? We'll be told that they did. But the reality is, there are many hidden labyrinths. And it's not just a physical labyrinth that you're looking at, it's also a labyrinth of the mind. And so what do I mean by that? I mean that a lot of times there's a lot of circuitous thought processes. There's a lot of overanalyzation that goes into everything. Or a saying that I had back when I was still teaching, analysis paralysis. And that seemed to be something that they were inflicting on a lot of people, especially at the start of the 21st century, and not just in the academic realm, but in the corporate realm and in the military realm. People were always trying to use analytics to find the greatest solutions to all of life's problems. There is a hidden section to the library, and there are different ways that one could potentially physically access it. Although, is it easy? Is it something that's recommended? Perhaps not. But isn't it interesting how many times simple awareness of the existence of something, whether it's an idea or a physical item, suddenly changes a lot of aspects within how it exists in the realm that we interact with? Well, I hope you enjoyed this little alternative exploration and this departure from what I usually do. And please engage me in the comments and let me know what you think.
My profile was too high. I need to be able to operate freely. No one's asking questions anymore. We become sheep. But I don't trust the shepherds.